Good morning. David, quit laughing. Once again, we always seem to comment on the suddenness of being on live. I'm Kurtis. I'm finishing a teaching on me and Jesus. This is part 2. And I would encourage you, if this is the first thing you're looking at or listening to, you might want to go back and listen on YouTube to part 1, because we're concluding that today. And before I get into the new part of this message, I want to repeat a brief section from last week, just so we can be on the same page. So let me do that. Cognitive dissonance is the mental conflict that occurs when our beliefs, concepts, or assumptions are contradicted by new information. Research shows that when people are confronted with challenging new information, they will seek to preserve their current understanding and maintain internal consistency by rejecting, explaining away, or avoiding new information. They will also convince themselves that no conflict really exists. We have a strong inner need to ensure that our beliefs, our identity, and our behaviors are consistent. When what you believe is challenged, something must change in order to eliminate or reduce the dissonance caused from the lack of agreement. Today's Christians are faced with spiritual cognitive dissonance when their strongly held religious concepts are challenged by the revelation of spiritual union, oneness, and identity. We convince ourselves that no conflict really exists. Almost every Christian sees their spiritual identity from the perspective of me and Jesus. We receive Christ in union, but we never let that union become oneness. We never let it result in the spiritual identity of the Son. Christians resolve this spiritual cognitive dissonance by taking on the form or appearance of a spiritual son. But they deny the power of God's seed to bring forth the true image and identity of that son. 2 Timothy wrote in 3:5, holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power. We search for knowledge, but then deny the spiritual understanding of that knowledge. Knowledge then becomes the end in itself and not the means to the end. Revelation knowledge that does not bring forth the understanding of your true spiritual identity always becomes religion. If the revelation of the seed and the spiritual birthing does not bring us into an understanding of oneness and the identity of the Son, then it becomes no better than just another religious denomination. I want to repeat a statement that I wrote last week, and I want to know if you agree with this. We live in a relationship with God as an adopted child, conforming and changing ourselves into the image of Jesus, doing all of this through our faith in Christ. Now, I hope you got that. Because I'm going to tell you, 99% of the church goes, what's wrong with that? That was well said. Way to go, Kurtis. Way to go. You put it all in a nutshell. In fact, this is what you see. You see, the diagram, go back to the diagram. You see me and Jesus, with me in red and Jesus in blue. And when you accept Christ, the blue goes into the red. And it becomes me and Jesus. And as you grow more mature, the Jesus gets bigger. And as he becomes Lord of your life, that blue dot is so large that you don't see the red dot much. But it doesn't matter how much of the red dot you see, because Jesus and you are still two people. This is your understanding. Let me also repeat from last week that if you can find no problem with what I just said, then you are deeply entrenched in the delusion of religion in a two-person gospel. Today's church is deeply religious, living in a lukewarm coexistence with Jesus. I will conclude this message today and discuss the last three. Last week I said 4, but for time's sake, I'm going to cut it down to 4. Cut it down to 3. I will conclude this message today and discuss the last 3 most common erroneous concepts that come out of our spiritual cognitive dissonance. These 3 erroneous concepts keep us in religious bondage and distract us from learning and understanding who we are as the sons of God. The church today is in a great identity crisis. The word conforming means to comply, to act in accordance with a wish, a command, and to meet specific standards put on us by others. It is a tendency to align our attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and even our identities with those around us. It is motivated by our need for acceptance. It is fueled by our fears, and it finds its life in our need for identity. Conformity establishes who we are and is measured by the sum total of our failures and our successes, our highs and our lows. Every morning we wake up to become the person we think we should be. This need to conform fractures our identity. It forces us to question our authenticity. Every day we put on our religious, our social, our political, our ethnic, and our sexual selves. We are who we need to be at any given moment, and we surround ourselves with those other conformists who look just like me. But you need to listen, because down deep, we are angry, frustrated, guilt-ridden, and we hate ourselves. Yes, I said that. Down deep, we hate who we are. Conformity has forced us to live an empty lie. Truth be told, we hate the person looking back in the mirror. But today, you say, I'm going to smile and be the person the world tells me to be. For those of you in the UK Sun newspaper published a recent poll revealing that a UK-wide study reveals the extent to which the younger generation feels disillusioned, with the majority, 89% of 16 to 29-year-olds claiming their life lacks purpose and meaning. lacks purpose. I want you to hold on to that word, purpose. This is compared to an average of 80% who believe their life lacks purpose and meaning across all ages. Truly, as David taught, their deepest need is to find their purposed identity. Conformity is like a change of clothes. It changes what you look like, but it doesn't change who you are. Every Christian looks in the mirror and all they see is their failure to be like Jesus. They say, if I were more like Jesus, I would have never acted like that today. Why can't I just get it right and be more like Jesus? They say, I need to be a better Christian. This is spoken every day in the minds and from the mouths of those who are in Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Sex, Love, Addicts Anonymous. These are true places. Anger management and failure management. Every day they look in the mirror and say that. And every day they look in the mirror and hate who they are. Behavior therapy and behavior modification is nothing more than the delusion of conformity and change. Our identity cannot be changed. As is famously said, people don't change. And they're right. People don't change. They can modify, but they cannot change. Born-again believers are in an identity crisis, and they're becoming helplessly disillusioned. As a result, they are leaving the church in record numbers, for the churches have merely shifted the guilt from what they were doing as sinners to what they're not doing as believers. Nothing in their life has changed. The only thing that's changed is who and what they are conforming to. They have traded a life of conforming to the world for a life of trying to conform to Jesus. Every day they wake up in a do loop of trying and failing and trying and failing and trying and failing and trying and failing. 52 weeks of the year. 80 years of their life. A do loop of failure. 52 weeks of the year. Every day, 7 days a week. The do loop of trying and failing. If to me and Jesus' understanding were a tree, conformity and change would be its fruit. The born again are weary, tired, and stressed. But Jesus said in Matthew 11:28, come to me all you who are weary, exhausted, worn out, and burdened, weighed down, and I will give you rest. And he said in John 8:34-36, and Pete, this is the title of my message in Chicago. Very truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. He didn't say, if I set you free. Is he speaking third person here? Or is he telling you something? If the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. That's the message, Pete. The Son sets you free. I want to tell you a story about a woman that Jenny and I got to share with a month and a half, 2 months ago in a restaurant in Dallas. Her and her husband were down visiting from the Northeast U.S. He said that the father had brought him there to find something. So they were visiting a church in Oak Cliff. And I invited him to the table, and we went on to talk. And I started to share the message of sonship. And the woman looked at me, and she said, I have lived my entire life under the law. She says, I've lived my entire life with guilt and shame of what I had done as a teenager. And she said, I've never been free. She says, this sets me free. And her husband looked at her and he said, I never knew you felt that way. And she said, I never told you. She was ashamed. She was ashamed that she had never conformed to being the Christian she was expected to be every Sunday morning. And the Son set her free. And it wasn't only Christ, but it was the knowledge and understanding that she was the Son. And she was a new creation. And don't get me wrong. Many of you not only live with trying to change what you have done, but you live with trying to forget what was done to you. The sexual abuse as a child, that wasn't your decision. How do I get over that? Every day I look in the mirror and I hate who I see. And I didn't do it. But the Son, this message today, will set you free. Jesus said, so if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. It is the understanding and the knowledge of this message that sets you free. And that's what that woman said. All these years, I've been in bondage to the law and to guilt and condemnation. And she said, today I'm free. You have spent your entire life with an understanding of the statement, you've understood this whole passage with an understanding of that statement through the eyes of the two-person gospel. The me and Jesus gospel. You believe that Jesus is going to step into your life. Hey, I'm here, and set you free. But that is not what he said. He said that a spiritually birthed, eternal Son is birthed into God's family. And it is through being born again of the imperishable seed of Christ as the Son that will make that you will be made free indeed. There is your identity. There is your freedom. If there was ever a need in the church, if there was ever a need for a voice in the church to teach our new creation identity, it is today. Sadly, no one is. The search for identity is the most timeless of all man's needs, going back to the very creation. In Genesis 3:2-4, the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden. But God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree which is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." The serpent said, "You will not certainly die. For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And with that statement, Satan introduced the three spiritual delusions of conformity, change, and into. These three religious concepts are the beating heart of the me and Jesus understanding. Spiritually birthed sons are not like God. They have the fullness and the spiritual identity of the Father. They were birthed with the essence of God, the Father, the I am. But Satan wants you to think you can be like Jesus. You can be like the Son. You can be like God. And there's the deception. We're worried about fake news in the media. Have you ever wondered about the fake news of the gospel in the church? The fake news of the gospel, conformity, change, and into. And we're going to drive a stake through the heart of those lifeless delusions, and we're going to set the captives free. Paul writes in the letter of the Romans 12:2, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship." And, it's the same thought. And, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good, acceptable, and perfect. That word conformed. You know, there's two words for conformed in the Greek. We're going to look at this in a minute. Sus ke metiso. This is the conformed mentioned in Romans 12. We're going to look at another conformed in Romans 8:28-30. And let's read that verse. "And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God." Okay, end it right there. That's all we're going to remember in memory verse. Don't you know God causes all things to work together for the good? But have you ever read the rest of it? "For those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose." Oh, there's that word. 90%, 80% across every age, 90% of 18 to 29-year-olds in the UK don't have purpose. Okay, let's go beyond the UK. The world does not have purpose. And here it is. "For those who are called according to his purpose." For those he foreknew, this is the same thought. He predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. And these whom he predestined, he also called. And these whom he called, he also justified. And these whom he justified, he also glorified. What you know and understand about these two passages is a difference between your freedom or your bondage. Spiritual life or religion. Knowing your identity as the spiritual son shall set you free and give you life. To not know it will put you in bondage and you'll live death. The first point today, question, are we conformed or transformed? Are we conformed or transformed? Now, we saw two very different uses of the word conformed in Romans 8 and Romans 12. Let's look at those. Romans 12:2. Therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Now let's just stop there a minute. I've talked about this a number of times. What did the Jews do in a sacrifice with a lamb? They drained its blood, slit its throat, and drained its blood. That's why Paul says, be a living sacrifice. Don't slit your throat. Be a living sacrifice. Because what Paul is saying is he's not talking about draining your blood. For what's in the blood? Life. But what else is in the blood? Your DNA, your identity. Paul is talking about your identity. Slit your throat. Drain your identity. Don't slit your throat, but drain your identity. And do not be conformed, sus ke metizo, to this world, but be transformed, metamorpho, by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. Now, the Father's revealed this to me in 3 stages over the last 2 years. Let's look at the words sus ke metizo. That word conform means to be identified with. We're talking about identity. To be identified with. So right off the bat, we're talking about the word identity. It means having an outward shape, properly assuming a similar outward form by following the same pattern. I'm trying to conform to Jesus. I'm trying to follow the pattern of Jesus. I'm trying to live like Jesus. I think of the word imitation when I read this Greek definition. Let's all imitate Jesus. Let's all get it together in this church and let's imitate Jesus. That's what Paul says. Do not be conformed to this world. Present yourself a living sacrifice. Drain your identity. Do not have the identities of this world, but be transformed. What does that word mean? Metamorpho. That is a powerful word. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That word transformed in the Greek means changing form in keeping with the inner reality. What's the inner reality to the believer? It's the Son. That's who you were when you were birthed. Changing form in keeping with your inner reality. means properly transformed after being with, transfigured. It's where we get the word metamorphosis from. That's how powerful that word is. After being with. The Kurtis translation of that, transformed after being in union with Christ. Transformed after being with. Transformed after being in union with Christ. There's never been a more clear contrast between our identities in the flesh and our identity as a spiritual son than Romans 12, 1 through 2. But let me go on to the second part of Romans, verse 2. The one I said where the Father has been revealing it to me in stages. We can never know the perfect, good, and acceptable will of God until the process of sonship begins to transform us by the renewing of our minds. James writes in 1:5 through 8, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask of God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded with dual identities and unstable and chaotic in all they do. So if you're not being transformed by the renewing of your mind, and you're double-minded, living dual identities, and in chaos because of that, then you'll never understand the perfect, acceptable, and good will of God. So when Paul was talking about identity in Romans 12, 1 through 2, it's all about identity. And it comes about very simply by the renewing of your mind. Because you already are. Your inner reality is the Son. But is that in Toy Story 2 with Stinky Pete, when he looked at Woody and he said, why, you don't know who you are, do you? You don't know who you are. You don't know what the inner reality really is. You will never understand the things that God has given you or prove the perfect will for you through an understanding of me and Jesus. In Romans 8, 28 through 30, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. A prothesis. A prothesis. Now, I like to read that as prothesis, because when you're writing a doctorate paper, you have to write a preliminary thesis. And that word prothesis means pre-thesis. Let's pause here and look at that word purpose. A prothesis. It means before, properly, literally a setting forth in advance, for a specific purpose. Purpose, purpose, purpose. I bring that word up every time I hear it because I want you to see it. Purpose. Young people in the UK, purpose. So what is a pre-thesis or a preliminary thesis? In the world of the academics today, a preliminary thesis is a statement or a defining question that your research and conclusions will prove. So Paul is about to define God's pre-thesis for man. He's about to tell you what his purpose for man is. Because he says, right after he says the word purpose, he says for. So verse 29 is all about the purpose. For verse 29 says, for those who he foreknew, he also predestined. He just didn't make it up as he went along. He predestined this before the foundations of this world. He predestined to become conformed. There's another conform. That's not the conformed we saw in Romans 12. This is another one. In English, we just have word conformed. But in the Greek, they break it down. An outward conforming or an inner transfiguration. He predestined for us to be conformed. Somorphos. That's a different word. To the image, the icon. We call it the icon today because that's where we get that word from, icon. To be conformed, somorphos, to the icon of his Son. He didn't say of Jesus. He said of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn. Wait a minute. He's talking about brothers now. The eldest, the first in time, the preeminent, refers to the firstborn among others who follow. The firstborn among many brothers. And these whom he predestined, he also called. And these whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. That word conform, what did you name it? No sister. The word actually, okay. We're outnumbered, brother. There is no male nor female in Christ.
Correct. So those numbers don't matter.
Those numbers don't matter.
That's right.
What does that word conform mean in the Greek? Somorphos. In the Greek word study, it means being conformed by sharing the same inner essence. The same identity, showing similar behavior from having the same essential nature. That's not an outward imitation. This is an inner essence. The icon, as we call it, assumes a prototype of which it not merely resembles. Notice this. An icon, an icon, assumes a prototype of which it not merely resembles, but from which it is drawn. That's right. A pitcher of water and a glass of water. It exactly reflects its source. Christ is the very image. This is where we see this in 2 Corinthians 4:4, Colossians 1:15. Christ is the very image, the supreme expression of the Godhead. So if Christ is this word, and he's the expression and image of the Godhead, and we are the image of his Son, that should tell you something. We are birthed spiritual sons of God through the seed of God, which is Christ, from which we are drawn. John 1:12 through 13. But as many as received Christ, to them gave he power, the right, the authority to become, this is the most important word in the sentence, the sons of God. And if he was speaking to you, Rachel, he would have said, the Son of God. But he's speaking to more, so he says, the sons, the. Don't ever say the Son. People are going to think you're Jesus. Well, Jesus said this. He gave this to John. But as many as received Christ, to them gave he the right and the authority to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. This is a spiritual work here. You can stand in front of the mirror all day long and want to change. It ain't going to happen. Convince yourself who you are. Let someone tell you who the promises of God about you are. That doesn't change you. And I'm going to borrow something from David Kinderbrew if he will give me the privilege to do so. David has spoken many times. And you want to give it? You want to do it, brother? You want to do it? I'm serious.
Go ahead.
Okay. I'm serious.
I'm fine. Johnny's okay? You got the permission of the Son. Your son.
He gives a testimony of a vision, of an encounter, of a conversation he had with the Father. How many years ago was that, brother?
30-something.
30-something years ago.
Yeah.
And I'm going to reduce this down to the key, the essence of what I'm going to talk about. The Father said to David, David, you are the Son. David responded and said, I am a son. And the Father told David, David, does not every son have the right, the authority? Where have we seen that word? Does not every son have the authority to say, I am the son of my Father? Do you understand, David? That was right back to John chapter 1. To those who receive him, he has given the right to become the Son. Let's again review, and just in review, those two words, conforming in the Greek. The first, as we saw in Romans 12, was do not be conformed to this world. It is assuming the taking on of a similar outward form. It's an imitation. To become similar in nature and character. The second conformed we see in Romans 8. For those whom he foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. That conform means to become similar by sharing the same inner identity. Becoming similar behavior from having the same essential nature. It is very important to distinguish between these two. The first is religion. And religion can only make you like someone. Religion is nothing more than you changing your clothes, because it doesn't change who you are. This two-person gospel, me and Jesus, you were taught today, is empty. It's incomplete and will not reveal your true spiritual identity. When your mind sees me and Jesus, there can be no understanding of oneness. You cannot get to oneness and your identity as the spiritual son from your understanding of me and Jesus. You will never understand God's purposed identity for you. Again, in the UK newspaper, when they published this recent poll this week, it revealed the extent to which the younger generation feels disillusioned, with the majority, 89% of 16 to 29-year-olds, claiming their life lacks purpose or meaning. The second, are you changed or are you exchanged? It was changed last week, in front of Rhema Life Church in Plano. For over a year, I drive by it, and it read, where lives are changed. South Carolina and Indiana both have a second chance church. Mesquite, Texas, down the street, has another chance family fellowship. Christian businessman and author Timothy Keller writes in his preface of his 2012 book titled Every Good Endeavor, he quote, I learned that I was supposed to be changed by the gospel of Jesus Christ and therefore be used of God in my relationship with others. It's just not in every title of a church. It's in a best-selling book. Change. You got to be changed. Jesus needs to change your life. We love second chances. We love the concept of change. We cry out to God in our prayer closet, please change me, Lord. But are change and second chances just delusional religious concepts? Do they lock us into the me and Jesus gospel? I made the comment earlier that people cannot change. They cannot change. They can modify their behavior, but they cannot change. Born-again believers are never told by the Apostle Paul to change, or that they have been changed. And yet, it remains every believer's focus and the measure of spiritual maturity. How much have you changed, David? David said he changed church this morning. Change and conformity are the two strongest religious concepts that keep every believer in bondage to their self-created identities. Just like conformity, the delusion of change inhibits the believer from seeing themselves as a spiritually birthed new creation. It keeps them from seeing themselves as another person. Let's look at these two words, changed and exchanged. Change is defined as to become different. When the temperature changes, it may be different, but it's still temperature. It's the same you. You may be a little different, but it's still the same you. Merriam-Webster definition of exchange. It's the act of giving or taking one thing in return for another, to have replaced. It's not change, it's exchange. I'm not modifying it, I'm exchanging it. What I'm getting is different, it's new. 2 Corinthians 5:16 through 20. Therefore, from now on, we recognize no one according to the flesh, even though we have known Christ according to the flesh, and we discussed that last week, yet now we know him in this way no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creature. The old things have passed away. Behold, new things have come. New. The kainos. The kainos. A creature. The katesis. What do those words mean? The kainos. It means not found like this before. You have become a person not found like this before. That's not changed. That's not conformed. That's an exchange. The katesis means the creation, means properly a creation, which is founded from nothing. So you are a new creation, never seen before and founded from nothing. He's not using the old you to put together this new creature. It's founded from nothing. What about nothing is the old you? Nothing isn't about nothing. There's nothing he uses of the old you. Well, I kind of like this a little bit about Catherine, so I'm going to carry that over here. Nothing. Founded from nothing. He isn't using you any way, shape, or form. Verse 18. Now all these things is a continuation. Now all these things are from God who reconciled. Katesis. No, excuse me. Huh? Yes. Now all these things are from God who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. Namely, that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. Now he said that word 3 times so far. Not counting their trespasses against them, and he has committed to us the word of reconciliation. Therefore we are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were making an appeal through us. We beg you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God. Do you think Paul's trying to say something? He has used the word reconcile 5 times. The word reconcile means it was originally used in the exchange of coins. That word reconcile carries with it the meaning of exchange, not change. So let's read this verse. And in fact, he uses the word reconcile, reconciled, reconciling. Another variation of that word means reconciliation as a result of Christ's exact exchanging his righteousness for our guilt. He didn't change our guilt for righteousness. He exchanged it. This whole verse 5 times is filled with the word exchange. So let's reword that verse, and instead of reconcile, let's use the word exchanged. Now all these things are from God, who exchanged us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of exchange. Namely, that God was in Christ exchanging the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them. And he has committed to us the word of exchange. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, as though Christ were making an appeal through us. We beg you on behalf of Christ, be exchanged to God. He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Colossians 1:19 through 20. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him, and through him to reconcile, to exchange all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of the cross. And through Christ, to exchange all things to himself. And there it is. Through Christ, God's seed, we are spiritually rebirthed to become another person, exchanging, Rachel, exchanging your past life and your past identity for the new creation identity as the spiritual son. The last one we're going to look at. Are we conformed into or to the image? We saw it in Romans 8:28. For whom he did foreknow, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. We think that's Jesus. We read that, we hear that, we go, I'm being changed into the image of Jesus. I'm being changed into the image of Jesus. You are being conformed to the image of his Son. It doesn't say Jesus, it says his Son. Paul's saying something here. If he wanted to say Christ, he'd have said Christ. On the surface, that's an acceptable understanding. But beneath that is spiritual. And he's saying, you're being conformed to the image of his Son. The definition of the word to means the expressing the result of a process or action. It is expressing a point reached at the end of a period of time. It's the result of an action. When you go from something to something, that's exchange. The word into means the result that someone or something becomes enclosed or surrounded by something else. That's Jesus in me. Jesus is enclosed in me. He's put into me. Let's go back to that idea of metamorphosis. We always hear that a caterpillar changes into a butterfly. You go to Google, 80%, 90% of the wording says a caterpillar changes into a butterfly. But that is incorrect. A caterpillar changes to a butterfly. You think, well, that's just semantics. No, it's not. While in the cocoon, the caterpillar dies and it dissolves into a goo. If you disrupt a cocoon, it will be a goo. Science now tells us that the complete genetic code of the caterpillar is rewritten while in this state. Think about that. The caterpillar dies, and the genetic code is rewritten. The resulting butterfly or moth is not different. It's not changed. It's not a changed version of a caterpillar. It's a genetically different new creature. That's metamorphosis. That's transformed. A butterfly is not conformed from a caterpillar. It's not changed into a butterfly. It's changed to. It's genetically different. This is metamorphosis. The mystery, another Chicago title. The mystery is not how or what, but whom you become. We're going to hit this hard in Chicago. The mystery is not about how, it's not about what. The mystery is about who. This is what Paul is saying in Romans 12:2. It's what he's saying in Romans 8:29. It's what Paul is saying in the entire letter to the Romans. It's what he's saying in every letter he wrote. The answer to every question you ask, I don't care what it is, every spiritual question you ask is about spiritual union, becoming oneness, and leading to our new spiritual identity as a who, as the Son. God is not putting Jesus into you, nor is he changing you into the image of Jesus. But this is exactly what we hear and think when this verse is read. God is spiritually birthing you to become another person. That new person is conformed to a spiritual son. This spiritual seed has joined in union with your spirit, and that resulting oneness has created a new spiritual person, the spiritual son. And because of your unique, God-given soul, you stand as a unique spiritual son to your Heavenly Father. That unique spiritual son has the spiritual essence and identity of the Father God. In conclusion, what do the words conform, change, and into all have in common? They all begin and end. They all begin and end with you being the same person. These concepts allow Christ to come into your life as an invited guest. Jesus, please come into my life as my guest. And they justify the me and Jesus understanding. This understanding puts the responsibility of living the Christian life on you, the believer. And sadly, this understanding also puts the full weight of failure on you. And that's why you look in the mirror every day and you go, if I could just be more like Jesus, I wouldn't hate who I'm looking at. Is there any doubt why believers are leaving the churches in record numbers in search of something more? Everyone listening today has either been or still is in the despair of the me and Jesus understanding. Simply this is religion at its best. This is religion. Religion has never reached a greater point of the me and Jesus, of the two-person gospel. But this is not who the born again truly are. Through our spiritual birthing and through the renewing of our minds, we can understand that we are transformed, exchanged, and transfigured to the image of God's Son. It is in this understanding that you are truly made free. Let me again close with a simple diagram that speaks volumes. We'll briefly hit this. This is your spiritual reality. Me and Jesus, the red and the blue, become a new creation. The little blue is not in the big red. The red and the blue become purple. You become another person. Religion takes the same you and it ends with the same you. What God purposed before the foundation of time was that you become that purple sun. the new creation, identity of the spiritual son. Almost every time I share this diagram with a brother or sister, I got the word sister in this, see? A brother or sister, they ask, so what difference does this really make? They don't argue with it. They just go, so what difference does this make? I tell them, it replaces everything you think, everything you know, and everything you understand. It affects the very identity of whom you think you are. As you begin to understand becoming another person, it dominoes through everything in your life. You will never be the same. You'll never be the same once you understand this. I will close with David Kinnebru's favorite scene from the movie The Matrix. Quote from a line from The Matrix. You take the blue pill. The story ends. And you wake up in your bed and you believe whatever you want to believe. You believe whatever delusion you want to believe. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. I show you how deep this revelation goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth. From Ephesians 1, I close with this prayer. I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you. Remember the mystery is Christ birthed in you the hope of glory, that you may know the hope to which he has called you, the riches of his glory inheritance in his holy people, and his incomparably great power for those who believe. And with that, I say amen. And we'll pick up right where we left off in Chicago next Saturday at the Identity Conference. Sonship and Identity Conference in Chicago. The Sonship and Identity Conference.